Good morning, everybody, and we are back today at our usual time, which is kind of depends where you are in the world, but it's morning here in the United Kingdom. We are in death sentence. Alex has undergone his procedure to turn him into a black suit. He's doing very well. He's one of the Warden's star pupils. He has had his surgery done. He's huge now. He's hulking. He's covered in these grotesque muscles that are going to split through his skin. His mind has been warped so that he thinks of himself as a predator, as someone whose job it is to destroy anyone who's weak. And his eyes are completely silver. The Warden, just to make sure that his transformation was complete, has put him through a test. The first part of the test was to escape a raging river that was kind of channeled through the rock. The second part of the test was that the Warden threw him basically into a nest of rats. And Alex, tore through these rats. He just demolished them, even the big ones. He is strong, he is fast, he's also deadly. And right at the end of that battle, he accidentally, in the heat of the moment, in the fury that he was feeling, killed Ozzy. Ozzy was one of Simon's friends, one of the lost boys that we met in Solitary. And sort of the little guy, very friendly, very sweet, wouldn't say boo to a goose. And Alex has just murdered him. And at the end of the last chapter, he was like, I don't care. I'm strong, I am new, and he's losing himself to it, which is terrifying. I always think a mental transformation like that is so much more terrifying than a physical transformation. The same way that kind of psychological torture is almost more terrifying than physical torture. But anyway, I'll see how many chapters we get through today. Alex is now a monster. So we will see what happens next. I hope you're all sitting comfortably, and I hope you all have your tea ready. If you don't have a cup of tea, I'm afraid I'll have to send the Queen round to confiscate all your belongings, which is what happens here in the UK. If you haven't got a cup of tea when the tea alarm goes off, then the Queen and her, all of her soldiers basically turn up at your door. All the beefeaters turn up at your door, and they take you off to the Tower of London. So a little known fact about the UK there. Okay, here we go. Belonging. I wasn't aware of the black suits entering the room until the electrified wire had been looped around my neck. The charge wasn't strong, more like the tickle of a million insects scuttling down my spine, burrowing into my muscles. But I was on the floor before I even knew I was falling. I couldn't have fought back, even if my life had been at stake. I just lay there, silent but for the hoarse whispers that rattled in my throat, watching the Warden's feet splash across the bloody rock and stop in front of me. He squatted, ducking his head down until it came into my line of sight. "Now that was impressive," he said, and I couldn't see his grin so much as feel it. He gently pulled the dripping chains from my knuckles, unlocking the manacles and throwing them across the room. "Very impressive. Such ferocity." He stood, and for a second I caught a glimpse of myself in the polished black leather of his shoe, my face too big, like a Halloween pumpkin carved with stitches, my eyes twin candles whose silver light looked on the verge of sputtering out. Then the Warden walked off, and my reflection was gone. "Get him up," he shouted over his shoulder. "Get him to his bed. He's earned it." The loop of wire around my neck disappeared, strong hands beneath my armpits guiding me back to my feet. I barely remembered how to put one leg in front of the other, but the black suits weren't going to let me fall. "That was good work," said the one to my left, his bass tones echoing around the chamber. "When we saw the water bubbling up from the hatch, we didn't think you were going to make it. That's where most of them fail." "But you punched through it like it was paper," said another, "and those rats never stood a chance." They chuckled, their laughter so deep I could feel it tremble across my skin like another electric charge. One kicked the limp corpse of a rat out of his way, and I watched it slide through a pool of its own blood before folding itself around a rock. Bodies lay everywhere, their silver eyes now the colour of lead, claws and teeth still bared as though they hadn't quite noticed they were dead. Wet stains bloomed across the walls and the floor like some strange subterranean fungus, looking almost black against the dark rock. The smell of decay already hung in the air, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the dying breaths of the rats, trapped forever in this tomb. I couldn't believe I was responsible for such carnage. It had started as self-defence, yes, but surely even the rats hadn't deserved to be culled so brutally. We reached a metal door, almost completely concealed by a pillar of stone, the warden leading the way through it into a bright corridor beyond. I took one last look into the chamber, saw Ozzy still propped up on his stake, watching over the legions of twitching bodies like he was the Lord of the Damned. Then the scene was lost behind the heavy door, my thoughts drowned out by the thunder of boots. It was only then that the pain started to seep in. Inside the chamber, the adrenaline and the nectar had kept me going, but now that the fight for my life was over, my body seemed to just give up. It started as a cramp deep inside me, as though every muscle was protesting about what I'd put it through. In places, that burning agony became something sharper, and in my delirious state I pictured the wounds on my shoulder, in my back, and across my stomach and chest, hanging open like mouths, screaming. I glanced down, watching a black and red rain fall from me as I was dragged along the corridor. I tried to draw attention to it, but the warden didn't seem concerned.
"You won't die,"
he said, looking back at me without breaking his stride.
"You can thank the nectar for that. Your body is, for want of a better word, superhuman. It would take something far more serious to terminate you now. Your wounds will heal in a couple of days, maybe even a few hours, and it will always be that way, just so long as you keep taking the nectar."
He reached a junction guarded by a black suit. The giant grinned at me as he wrenched open a metal door and ushered us through. "Glad you made it," the guard said. His words sparked the tiniest of memories, the ghost of something in my former life. I couldn't quite picture it, but I knew it had something to do with playing a game, feeling like I was part of a team. I did my best to return his smile, and although my bruised face prevented my lips from parting, I could feel the gleam in my eyes. "Thanks," I tried and failed to say. The room ahead was darker than the corridor we'd just left, the substantial shadows sweeping from corner to corner as though trying to hide what lay ahead. But nothing could be concealed from my new eyes, and as they focused I made out a long, narrow dormitory lined with what must have been 50 or 60 beds. It could have been the infirmary except for the absence of screens around each patient. That and the fact that the hulking giants in these beds weren't strapped down.
"These are your quarters from now on,"
the warden said, his soft voice matching the quiet darkness of the room.
"You will operate in shifts, but we'll worry about that tomorrow. For now, you just need to rest up and let those wounds close."
He nodded at the black suits who held me, and they eased me gently across the room before laying me down on an empty bed. I winced as the change of position caused the pain to flare up again, feeling the immaculate sheets turn warm and wet. Then somebody slid an IV into my arm, and the dusk of the room began to seep through my pores, collecting in my mind.
"Sleep," said
the warden, his voice the sound of a razor on a whetstone.
"When you wake, you'll feel much better than you ever have before."
He turned and marched from the room, the black suits a dark cloud in his wake, but he stopped before reaching the door.
"Because then you'll truly be one of us."
I don't know how long I slept. Devoid of dreams and nightmares, the featureless abyss of time could have been crossed in 1 night or 100 years. Even when the darkness parted and I found myself staring at the ceiling, I wasn't sure I'd actually woken. My body felt completely numb, the absence of pain surely too miraculous to be real. I lifted a hand, surprised to discover that I hadn't been strapped down, and I pressed my swollen fingers against my chest and my face. I could feel the touch, but that was all. There was no scream of ravaged flesh, no sting of stripped skin, no burning of strained muscles. It was as if my battle with the rats had never taken place. Maybe it hadn't. Even now the memory seemed vague and distant, like something I'd watched in a film or dreamed many years ago. It didn't seem possible that I had escaped a tunnel of ice-cold water by pounding my way through a metal hatch. It didn't seem possible that I'd taken an entire nest of deformed, rabid creatures and won. And surely it wasn't possible that I had killed an innocent kid. I clamped down on the thought before it could unfold, refusing to let the image of Ozzy's face enter my head. I had done what I'd needed to do to survive. That's all. Ozzy hadn't been one of us, he'd been one of them, one of the weak. He had died so that the killer in me could live, so that I could be whole. All black suits had to go through the same thing. I knew that now. I remembered Monty way back in another life, when I was a different person. He'd been taken, his body ripped apart and put back together the same way mine had been. And he'd been brought back to the cells in general population, let loose on his cellmate, Kevin. I'd never been able to figure out why, but it made sense now. Because once you'd killed in rage, taken a life without reason, there was no going back. It changed something inside you. It turned you from one of them into one of us, a black suit. That was the true test, I realised. Not the water, not the rats, but the taking of an innocent life. It was an accident, part of me argued. But had it been? I'd known the rats were all dead. I'd known there was nothing more to fear. Something else had made me lash out. Anger, yes, and hatred of what I'd once been, what Ozzy still was. Somewhere in the darkest part of me, I'd known exactly what I was doing. I felt a sudden pang of guilt, not over the death of Ozzy, but the death of Monty. He had shed his weaknesses and become a black suit, and I'd killed him. If only I'd known then what I knew now, knew the difference about the Warden and his prison, known what it could offer me, I never would have tried to escape. I heard something stirring and looked across the room to see 10 or so black suits rising from their beds. They moved as one, pulling back the sheets and getting to their feet, stretching their knotted muscles before donning suits and boots. In less than a minute they were dressed and filing from the room. One caught my eye as he passed and flashed me a silver wink. "You're awake. Good," he said without stopping. "I'll inform the Warden." They vanished through the door, before returning seconds later. Oh, at least that's what I thought had happened, till I studied the men walking into the room and noticed that these black suits were a different bunch. Their suits were creased and their faces drawn, their hands dirty. None of them looked my way as they slouched to a set of beds further down the ward, pulled off their suits, collapsed onto the mattresses and hooked IV needles into their arms. With a shudder of exhaustion, they all seemed to drift into sleep together. I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. There were bandages covering the areas where the worst injuries had been inflicted, but although each showed a reddish halo, there was no other indication that I'd been so much as scratched. Even the surgery wounds had lost their stitches, now nothing but faded scars beneath fresh skin. The Warden was right. I was superhuman, and it felt great. My grin must have been visible from the far end of the room, because it's the first thing the Warden seemed to notice when he entered.
"I told you you'd feel better after a good sleep,"
he said. I looked up, saw that he was carrying something over his shoulder. "How long was I out?" I asked, my voice like treacle. I was relieved to find that I could form words again.
"Only a night," he replied, "though it probably feels like a lifetime."
I nodded as he reached the bed, careful not to look him in the eye. I had changed, become far stronger than I ever had been, but the Warden was still the Warden, and his eyes spoke of truths that I never wanted to discover. He stood before me, using his free hand to pull my eyelid back, studying something beneath.
"You've recovered fully," he said. "No pain, no aches. Am I right?"
I nodded again.
"Then you're ready for this. Stand up."
I did as I was told, pushing myself off the bed. For an instant I thought the Warden had shrunk, until I realised it was me who had grown taller by at least half a metre. I had obviously been too exhausted to notice the previous night. The Warden looked me up and down, then lifted the object from his shoulder and held it out like a gift. My heart seemed to explode with joy, causing my muscles to lock and my throat to tighten. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, what the Warden was offering me.
"This is yours," he said. "Wear it with pride, and I know you are one of the first, because when the world turns and the strong have their way, then you will be amongst us. Here, try it on. It will fit."
And I knew it would, because nothing in the world surely could fit me more perfectly than the white shirt and black suit draped across the warden's arms. I choked on my thank you, but neither of us seemed to notice as I reached out and slotted an arm into my new uniform. The linen shirt was cool and soft, a new outer skin against my new inner one, and in my excitement I fumbled with the buttons. The warden cuffed my hands aside, straightening the jacket over my shoulders, then doing up the shirt like a father dressing his child. Seconds later, I stood before him, fully dressed, while he knotted the tie around my neck. He patted it down against my shirt and took a step back, and I swear I could see my glowing pride reflected in his face as he looked me up and down once again.
"Perfect," he said eventually. "Welcome home, soldier of Furnace."
The tour. I followed the warden with my head held high, enjoying the sound of my new boots as they beat out a rhythm on the stone, and the crisp coolness of the suit that clung to my muscles like silk. Every time we passed a guard in the corridor, he would nod at me, and I would return the gesture, knowing at long last what it meant to belong, to be a soldier of Furnace.
"You have seen most of the prison from one side of the bars or the other."
The warden spoke over his shoulder as I walked, with only a trace of annoyance in his words.
"But we shall forgive your past trespasses. Only now will you understand the truth of what takes place here, of what we have created."
He reached the end of the passageway and turned left, stopping at another guarded door. The black suit released a huge lock, then pulled the gate open, slamming it as soon as we had passed. I recognised the corridor we were in by the junction up ahead, the right passage ending in the incinerator, the left heading up past the surgery rooms into infirmary. But the warden led us straight ahead. I'd been up this way before. The ghost of a memory haunted my thoughts, showing me a corridor leading off to the right, and dozens of crooked creatures in filthy jackets and gas masks staggering down it. "Wheezers," I said, fear slowing me down. The warden looked over his shoulder and spat out a dry laugh.
"Ha! So you have been down here," he said. "Did you get as far as their cells?"
"No," I replied, picking up speed again and joining the warden. "No, there were too many of them."
"You had just killed one of their brothers. They don't take too kindly to that. They won't recognise you now, though."
The corridor ahead was deserted, with no sign of the creatures who had infested it before. It ended in another door, this one unmanned. The warden gripped the handle and twisted, opening it with a squeal that sounded almost human. As soon as that had faded, I could make out music beyond, the sound chillingly unfamiliar after so long in Furnace. I moved towards it, but he held out a hand to stop me.
"As I said, the Wheezers won't remember that you're the one responsible for the death of their brother, but that doesn't mean it isn't dangerous. Stay in the middle of the room, don't approach any of the cells, and do not look them in the eye."
It might have been my imagination, but I thought I could sense the slightest trace of anxiety in the warden's voice. However, without another word, he turned and walked through the door, his broad steps, if anything, more confident than before. Beyond was another room the same size as the infirmary. The music came from an old-fashioned gramophone perched in the middle of the rock floor, a record spinning unevenly on the turntable and the sound spiralling out from its large horn. A woman sang in a strange language, the same one as from my dreams, her voice scratchy and faint, but beautiful all the same. I felt something inside me melt at the sweetness of her song, the melody like a knife that cut through the fog and let distant memories bob to the surface of my mind. It lasted only a second as I let my eyes take in the rest of the room. There were no beds this time, But the ward was far from empty. Even with my new body and the strength it contained, I felt my step faltering. It wasn't quite fear, more a faint echo of it, but it still made my legs weak. Lining both sides were open metal cages, almost like cattle stalls, bolted into the wall, and inside almost every one stood a wheezer. They all seemed to be convulsing, their bodies juddering and spasming, moving too fast for any human. As soon as they saw us, their piggy eyes narrowed and they let loose a collective wheeze, a chorus of hoarse screams that made me want to run from the room, black suit or no black suit. The warden must have sensed my hesitation, ushering me on with an urgent wave of his hand.
"Don't stop," he hissed over the music. "Don't attract their attention."
Even as he spoke, one of the wheezers staggered forwards from its cell, moving like somebody who's just been stabbed. It lurched across the stone floor towards us, using one unsteady hand to pull its jacket aside, revealing the needles strung up beneath. The warden seemed to shrink away for an instant before collecting himself.
"Back!"
he barked, moving towards the wheezer with frightening speed.
"Get back to your cell, now!"
The wheezer ground to a halt, watching the warden through the lifeless lumps of coal that served as its eyes. It twitched a couple of times, its head snapping back and a sickening gargle rattling out from behind the gas mask stitched into its skin. Then it slowly turned, traipsing like some zombie, back to its cell.
"Come,"
the warden said, his voice much quieter but carrying the same sense of authority,
"before they all start to take an interest."
I followed him down the length of the room, barely able to take my eyes off the dozens of convulsing wheezers. There must have been 50 in here, at least, all identical, with their pale, wrinkled skin and their filthy jackets. Luckily, none seemed remotely concerned, as we opened a door embedded in the far wall, and the only thing that chased us out was another symphony of wheezed screams that concealed the end of the song.
"The north wing is theirs,"
the warden said once the door had been sealed. We were in another corridor, this one lined with several openings that resembled the storerooms on the other side of the prison's underbelly. He marched down the passageway, casting his words over his shoulder.
"It isn't wise to come here alone unless they call on you."
"But what are they?" I asked, my heart still running up and down my ribcage. I thought back to my dreams, visions of young men in trench coats and gas masks, and found myself answering my own question. They're the same as the men in my nightmares, aren't they? They used to be soldiers. The warden peered back at me, and I caught his eye. In the space of a single heartbeat, time seemed to unravel, the world disintegrating into a mosaic of brutal images, bombs exploding in mud, dead bodies in trenches, and the same wheezing figures stalking the shadows. Then I blinked, and reality reasserted itself with such force that I felt my head spin.
"Soldiers?"
the warden asked, stopping beside yet another door. He made no move to open it, staring at the worn metal as if lost in thought.
"We all used to be soldiers."
"But where?" I asked. "When?"
"A long, long time ago,"
he replied, his face suddenly as old as his voice. He was still for a moment more, obviously dwelling on some distant memory. Then he seemed to remember I was there.
"Come, let me show you something. It might help explain."
He turned the lock, pulled open the door, and led me right through the gates of the underworld. My first thought was that the room ahead was some kind of grotesque zoo. The air was filled with screams, roars, and strangled growls, the sounds seeming to battle for supremacy with the stench of waste and decay that clawed its way into my nose, making me want to puke. I reeled back, but the warden stopped me with a scowl.
"There is no escaping it,"
he said, gesturing forward with a leathered glove.
"This is your destiny now, your home."
My hand dropped, but I kept my back pressed firmly against the cool metal. It was the only thing stopping me from sinking to the floor. I let my gaze wander, but I didn't truly see anything. It was as if my eyes were too scared to settle on the horrors that lay before me in case they were dragged into the madness. The room was the same as the other wards, red stone walls stretching into shadows above my head, lights hanging down from the ceiling and painting every sick detail in their crimson glow. But while the infirmary and the black suit ward were ordered and still, and while even the wheezers had largely remained in their stalls, this place was bedlam. To the right of the room were a dozen or more cages, like the ones I'd seen in my dream. Glowing silver eyes peered at me from the darkness that swelled at the back of each iron box, and when the figures inside moved, I saw that they were dogs. Some were covered in fur and cowering against the bars. Others were twice as large, their skin peeled away to reveal the muscles beneath. These monstrosities threw themselves at us, causing the cages to bend outwards, their teeth like serrated knives. Directly opposite them lay a canvas screen, much larger than the ones in the infirmary. Sorry about all the crying. Don't know what's going on down there. Directly opposite them lay a canvas screen, much larger than the ones in the infirmary. Behind it I could glimpse more cages, although the pale forms that lay lifeless in these had none of the characteristics of dogs. I turned away before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the horror boiling up inside my throat. The warden paced slowly forwards, his hand clasped behind his back. I wasn't sure what to do, so I trotted after him, eyes on the floor to avoid the sights that surrounded me.
"Don't hide from it!"
The warden's voice curled up from the cacophony, a bell-clear whisper in my ear.
"You are part of this place now, just as it is part of you, and it is part of you. It flows in your veins, an infinity of power brought about by an eternity of suffering. Because all progress must come from pain. Look!"
I reluctantly obeyed, raising my head to see another cage on the same side of the room as the dogs. This one was much larger, at least 3 meters high and half as wide. And the creature inside almost filled it completely. Its misshapen head ducked low to avoid touching the top, and its immense frame so grotesquely muscled that it bulged through the bars. There were 4 IV stands positioned around the cage, each with 2 bags of nectar connected to needles in the creature's arms. It howled, rattling its cells so hard I was convinced the metal wouldn't hold, but then stopped when it saw us, cocking its head. I looked at its face, at the dripping, drooping maw, at the sunken eyes like silver pennies pressed into a ball of pink dough. And although there was no way I could have known who this creature was, somehow I did. Gary, I thought, and almost spoke the word aloud before remembering what had happened the last time. I couldn't quite recall why I wasn't supposed to know its name, the knowledge like an itch inside my skull. The warden stopped, and I could feel his gaze on my skin, scouring me for any sign of emotion.
"Do you know who this is?"
he asked. "No," I lied. The warden studied me for a moment longer before nodding.
"Another subject," he explained, "although this one has had an unusual reaction to the nectar. The procedure has wiped all trace of humanity from it, all its powers of rational thought and cognitive reasoning. It has become a creature of pure destructive power."
"A rat," I said. Again, the warden nodded. Another memory flashed across the darkness of my mind. A boy called Gary, devoid of emotion, willing to kill for nothing more than a thrill. The nectar hadn't turned him into a monster. How could it? He'd already been one. Again, the itch seemed to burrow into the bone of my skull, a tide of memories wanting to be released, and I spoke just to chase it away. If he's a rat, then why hasn't he been incinerated?
"Look at him,"
was the warden's reply.
"Physically he is far superior to the other specimens who have undertaken the procedure. The nectar has made his body grow at almost twice the normal rate, and it doesn't seem to be stopping."
The warden approached the cage and held out a hand. The creature took the bait, lashing through the bars with hooked fingers. The warden was too fast, ducking out of range with a humourless snigger.
"I want to know why, and so do the wheezers. We've had a number of specimens react this way, but we don't yet understand it. If we can find out what it was about his body that reacted so effectively with the nectar, then we can change the formula. We can ensure that all our new recruits..."
He said the last word with the same chilling laugh.
"Match his size and strength. Besides, specimens like this are of extreme interest to Alfred Furnace himself. They are his personal project, the Berserkers. He takes very special care of them."
"Here?" I asked. The presence of Gary alone was enough to strike terror into me, but the idea that there might be more like him, more killing machines of mutated muscle and uncontrollable fury, was enough to make me want to leap right out of my new suit and cower in the corner. The warden sensed my discomfort and flashed me another crooked smile.
"No, even this place cannot hold the Berserkers. They exist in a far more secure compound, Dr. Furnace's domain, a place you may one day see if you are lucky."
I stared at one of the IV bags, saw the darkness inside, and beyond that the golden dust that sparkled like distant galaxies. Even as I watched, I felt the nectar in my own blood respond to the sight, fueling my heart as it beat a little faster, sharpening my senses, so that the smells and sights and sounds of the room became almost unbearable. I wrenched my eyes away, focusing on the floor once again until the sense of vertigo had passed. "But what is the nectar?" I asked, if only to hear my own voice. "Where does it come from?"
"It comes from the very worst places of the world," the warden said, walking as he talked. "And the very best. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is. Neither could the wheezers, even if they spoke. Only Dr. Furnace knows, because he was the one who discovered it."
"Discovered it?" I started. We passed another screen and he pointed inside. I followed his finger, seeing an operating table beyond. On it, unconscious and twitching in its sleep, was a dog. Half of its body had been blown up like rotten fruit, the veins in its skin pumping black as the nectar pulsed through them.
"Alfred Furnace was there at the beginning."
The warden laughed, that sick laugh again.
"Well, we all were, but he was the mind who engineered the nectar, who created the first of us. He was the one who discovered that war does not just have to create horrors, but wonders too."
"I don't understand," I said. "You're saying that Furnace created the nectar during a war?"
"During the war,"
the warden replied. I shook my head, seeing more images from my dreams, the boys with swastikas on their prison uniforms, the soldiers with the same emblem emblazoned across their jackets. I knew what period in history those sites belonged to, but it was too long ago. "That's impossible," I said. The warden's face split open into a smile that seemed too wide, too gleeful, like a child remembering a seaside holiday.
"With the nectar, nothing is impossible," he replied. "It makes the human body a machine of infinite possibilities. Even age has no hold on us, with the power of Furnace in our veins."
I studied the warden's skin like old leather, my new eyes letting me see every tiny crack and wrinkle in his face. He seemed ancient, older than time. "But," I tried again, "but you can't have been alive."
"I was," he said,
once again letting his eyes crawl over my face.
"The nectar was created during the Second World War, and I was there to witness its birth."
So we're starting to understand some of the secrets behind... behind Furnace. I'm going to leave it there because... the next couple of chapters are really cool as well. This is definitely my favourite book of the series. I really, really like this one. So the next chapter is good. The chapter after that was, again, one of my absolute favourites to write. And then it just starts to really ramp up in terms of excitement and action. So those of you who have read the books will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who haven't, you'll just have to wait until tomorrow to find out what happens next. I hope you all have a lovely day. We've been so lucky with the weather here. We've been out in the garden a bit, enjoying the sun. It's supposed to get cold again next week, but it's been really lovely just to have a bit of sunshine. and to get out of the house, because obviously still in lockdown, there's limited things we can do. I hope that you've all got a sunny space you can go to, whether it's a garden or just a walk around the block, even a balcony, even just a big window that can open and let some sunshine in. And just soak it up if you've got sun. I know some of you've got snow, in which case probably don't open the windows, although it's still nice to get some fresh air. I don't know what I'm saying, I'm just rambling. Yeah, sorry about the screaming. My wife is completely outnumbered down there, and it's almost like she's stumbled into a room full of wheezers and they're all coming after us, so I should probably go and help out. But yeah, I'll be back tomorrow. And for part of 32, I think, today. No, part of 33 today. Is it part of 34 tomorrow? So many parts. And we are coming up for halfway through the entire series, I think. So another 30-odd parts to come. Can't wait. Anyway, I'll stop talking now, because you must be bored of my voice. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye.